A muddy field in northern France. 6,000 exhausted English soldiers. Across the open ground stand nearly 30,000 French knights, nobles, and men-at-arms, armored like walking fortresses and confident that the battle will be over in an afternoon. Yet by nightfall, the field will belong to the smaller army. How could such an imbalance end in one of the most shocking victories in medieval warfare? The answer begins long before arrows fill the sky. It begins with politics, because wars rarely start with swords. They start with ambition. The political background of the conflict lies in the long and bitter rivalry between the crowns of England and France during the 100 Years' War. For generations, English kings had claimed rights to French lands, partly through inheritance and partly through sheer determination to hold on to territory gained centuries earlier. Normandy, Gascony, and several strategic ports had become pieces on a chessboard of dynastic competition. French kings believed those lands rightfully belonged under their crown. English kings believed otherwise. By the early 15th century, the political climate in France was already dangerously unstable. The country was divided by internal factions, two powerful, noble houses, competing for influence over a king whose authority was weakening. One group supported the Burgundian faction, another backed the Armagnacs. These rivalries fractured the political unity of France at precisely the moment when unity was needed most. While France argued with itself, England watched carefully. Across the Channel, the English throne had recently passed to a young king determined to assert legitimacy and strength. Henry V of England had inherited a kingdom still haunted by domestic unrest and rebellions. Military success abroad offered something powerful: legitimacy. A victorious war could silence critics, unify nobles, and fill the royal treasury with prestige and ransom. From Henry's perspective, France was not just an enemy, it was an opportunity. Diplomatic negotiations between England and France had been tense for years. Claims over land, demands for tribute, and disputes about dynastic rights created a situation where compromise became increasingly difficult. Henry V pushed his demands aggressively. The French court dismissed them. What followed was the familiar medieval solution: war. But medieval warfare was rarely the romantic spectacle of shining knights that later legends imagined. Campaigns were logistical nightmares. Armies marched slowly, disease spread easily, and supply lines could collapse at any moment. Henry V knew this. His campaign in France was not a reckless charge into enemy territory. It was a calculated gamble designed to achieve a symbolic victory. The English invasion began with the siege of Harfleur, a strategic port city on the French coast. Capturing Harfleur was meant to open a gateway into northern France and demonstrate English strength. Yet the siege dragged on longer than expected. Disease spread among English troops: dysentery, fever, exhaustion. Soldiers who had marched confidently into France were suddenly weakened by conditions far more dangerous than enemy swords. By the time Harfleur finally fell, Henry's army had been reduced significantly. Thousands were sick or dead. Many historians estimate that the English force had shrunk to roughly 6,000 combat-ready soldiers. That number mattered because the king had originally hoped to conduct a much larger campaign. Instead of pushing deeper into France, Henry made a strategic decision. He would march north toward the English-held port of Calais. The journey would demonstrate English resilience and signal to allies that England could move armies through French territory at will. On paper, it looked like a bold maneuver. In reality, it was a dangerous retreat disguised as confidence. The French leadership quickly recognized the opportunity. A weakened English army moving slowly through hostile territory was an irresistible target. French nobles began gathering forces from across the kingdom. Knights eager for glory joined the march. Capturing the English king, or destroying his army, would deliver a powerful political message. The French army that assembled to intercept Henry was massive by medieval standards. Estimates vary, but many accounts place the number around 25 to 30,000 soldiers. Among them were some of the most powerful nobles in France, each commanding retinues of heavily armored knights and men-at-arms. In medieval society, knights were not just soldiers. They were symbols of prestige, wealth, and noble identity. This confidence shaped the French mindset before the battle even began. Many believed the outcome was already decided. A small, exhausted English army marching through mud and rain did not look like a serious threat. Henry V, however, understood something critical about warfare. Numbers alone do not decide battles. Terrain matters, discipline matters, weapons matter. Not all commanders throughout history have understood this. Some armies rely entirely on numerical advantage, assuming that overwhelming force guarantees victory. Yet battlefields often punish that assumption. Technology, positioning, and leadership can transform a smaller force into a dangerous opponent. As Henry's army moved through northern France, the weather turned cold and wet. Roads became rivers of mud. Supplies ran thin. English soldiers marched for days in armor, carrying weapons and hoping the French would not intercept them before reaching safety. But interception was exactly what the French intended. Near a small village called Agincourt, the two armies finally converged. The English found themselves blocked by a massive French force occupying the road north. Retreat was impossible. The only path forward led directly through the enemy. What happened next would turn this muddy field into one of the most studied battles in medieval history, and prove that the outcome of war is rarely as predictable as armies believe. If the political background explains why the two kingdoms were fighting, the armies themselves explain how such a battle could produce an unexpected result. On one side stood the traditional image of medieval warfare: armored French knights, nobles riding powerful war horses, protected by layers of steel and backed by thousands of men-at-arms. On the other side stood a very different kind of army, smaller, tired, and built around a weapon that would quietly change the balance of power on the battlefield. The English army marching with Henry V was not composed primarily of noble knights. In fact, the majority of his soldiers were longbowmen, professional archers drawn from England and Wales. These men were not aristocrats. Most came from rural communities where the longbow had been practiced for generations. English law even required regular archery training, meaning that by adulthood, many archers had spent years developing the strength needed to use the weapon effectively. The longbow itself was deceptively simple. Made from a single piece of yew wood, often taller than the man using it, the weapon required tremendous physical strength. Drawing it could demand over 100 pounds of force. But once mastered, it became a devastating tool. A trained archer could fire 10 to 12 arrows per minute, far faster than most crossbows of the period. Speed alone, however, was only part of the equation. Longbow arrows, especially the heavy bodkin point varieties, were designed to penetrate armor at close range. While medieval plate armor was impressive protection, it was not invincible. Gaps at joints, visors, and under the arms created vulnerable points. Even when armor stopped the arrow completely, the impact could still injure horses or destabilize charging knights. This meant the English army was built around firepower rather than shock cavalry. Longbowmen formed the backbone of the force, while a smaller number of dismounted knights and men-at-arms provided defensive strength in the center. These armored soldiers fought on foot, forming a disciplined line that could resist close combat. The French army looked very different. Its strength rested in its heavy cavalry and armored nobility. French knights were among the best-equipped warriors in Europe. Their armor could include chainmail, steel plate, padded garments, and helmets, designed to withstand sword blows and lance strikes. Mounted on large war horses bred for combat, they were meant to break enemy lines through sheer impact. In theory, the battlefield logic was straightforward. French cavalry would charge, smash into the enemy formation, and scatter the infantry. Once the line broke, the battle would quickly collapse into pursuit and capture. That approach had worked many times in medieval warfare. The prestige of the knightly class was built on exactly this kind of combat dominance. For generations, cavalry shock tactics had defined the elite of European armies. But warfare was already beginning to change. The English longbow had demonstrated its power in earlier battles such as Crécy and Poitiers, where disciplined archers had inflicted severe damage on charging cavalry. Despite these examples, many French nobles still believed that a determined charge by armored knights could overcome any obstacle. Confidence can sometimes become a strategic blind spot. The English soldiers understood the difference between the two armies very clearly. They knew they were outnumbered. They knew the French army contained far more nobles and professional fighters. Yet they also knew that their weapon, the longbow, could create a deadly defensive barrier, if used correctly. Each archer carried dozens of arrows, often stored in bundles or stuck directly into the ground before the battle began. Some arrows were designed to pierce armor. Others could cripple horses. When thousands of archers fired simultaneously, the sky itself seemed to darken. Another critical detail was preparation. English longbowmen carried wooden stakes, sharpened and driven into the ground at an angle in front of their positions. These stakes created a crude but effective anti-cavalry barrier. Charging horses faced a forest of pointed wood before even reaching the English line. The French army possessed powerful weapons as well. Crossbowmen, infantry, and large numbers of armored men-at-arms formed part of the force. But the French command structure reflected the social hierarchy of medieval Europe. Noble knights expected to lead the attack personally. Their prestige depended on it. That expectation would influence the entire battle. From a technical perspective, the contrast between the two armies was striking. One relied heavily on mobility and armored shock, while the other relied on projectile saturation and defensive discipline. In modern terms, it resembled the difference between a tank charge and a well-prepared anti-armored defense. Not all observers at the time recognized the importance of this shift in military technology. Some chroniclers still focused on heroic duels between knights rather than the broader tactical picture. Yet historians looking back at the battle often emphasize that the true engine of English success was not noble bravery. It was the coordinated use of longbow fire. Weapons alone, however, do not win battles. Leadership and strategy determine how those weapons are used. Henry V understood that his army could not defeat the French in a traditional open-field cavalry battle. Instead, he needed to force the enemy into conditions where their numerical advantage became a liability. As both armies faced each other near Agincourt, the English king began shaping the battlefield to suit his army's strengths. What he was preparing would transform the coming fight from a simple clash of numbers into a carefully engineered trap. Henry V spent the night before the battle studying the ground carefully. His army was smaller, tired, and dangerously exposed deep in hostile territory. Charging the French army directly would have been suicidal. Retreating was nearly impossible. The only realistic path to survival was to fight, but to fight on terms that neutralized the enemy's numerical advantage. The king chose a position between two wooded areas near the village of Agincourt. These forests acted like natural walls, narrowing the available battlefield into a long corridor. For the English army, this was ideal. Instead of facing 30,000 opponents across a wide-open plain, they would face them through a compressed front, where only a limited number could attack at once. This decision alone changed the mathematics of the battle. If thousands of French knights could not deploy simultaneously, their numbers meant less. Instead of overwhelming the English line in one massive wave, the attackers would be forced to advance through a bottleneck. That bottleneck would soon become the focus of thousands of English arrows. Henry arranged his army carefully. At the center stood the dismounted men-at-arms, heavily armored soldiers prepared to hold the line in close combat. These were professional fighters capable of resisting the impact of enemy charges. They carried swords, axes, and polearms designed for fighting armored opponents at close range. On both sides of this central block stood the longbowmen. Their formation looked almost like wings stretching outward from the center. This positioning allowed them to fire diagonally across the battlefield, creating overlapping fields of arrow fire. Any enemy advancing toward the English center would be exposed to attacks from multiple angles. Before the battle even began, the archers prepared their defenses. Each drove a sharpened wooden stake into the ground at an angle facing the enemy. These stakes were not large fortifications, but they were enough to discourage a full-speed cavalry charge. Horses are intelligent animals, and even well-trained war horses hesitate when confronted with a forest of pointed obstacles. The ground itself also played an unexpected role. Heavy rain had fallen in the days before the battle. The farmland between the two armies had been freshly plowed for winter crops. Under normal circumstances, this might not matter. But when thousands of armored men and horses began moving across it, the soft soil would turn into deep mud. Henry's strategy depended on patience. He knew that if the English army simply stood its ground, the French commanders would eventually feel pressure to attack. They outnumbered the English dramatically. Waiting too long could be seen as hesitation or even cowardice among the noble class. In medieval warfare, reputation mattered almost as much as victory. For many French knights, battle was not merely a military engagement. It was a stage for honor, prestige, and personal glory. Leading a charge against the enemy king could elevate a noble's status dramatically. That cultural expectation made restraint difficult. The English king also used psychology as part of his strategy. Early on the morning of the battle, Henry ordered his army to advance slightly forward, reducing the distance between the two sides. This move placed the English archers within effective shooting range while still remaining behind their defensive stakes. At the same time, it signaled confidence, suggesting that the smaller army was not afraid of the massive force waiting across the field. From the French perspective, this movement was provocative. The English appeared to be daring them to attack. Not all French commanders agreed on the best approach. Some suggested using missile troops, crossbowmen, to weaken the English before sending in the knights. Others recommended waiting until hunger or disease forced the English to withdraw. But coordinating such restraint among thousands of impatient nobles was difficult. Meanwhile, the English soldiers waited quietly behind their defensive line. Longbowmen planted arrows into the ground in front of them, ready for rapid firing. Men-at-arms adjusted their armor and tightened helmet straps. Many soldiers had marched for weeks through enemy territory. They knew this battle might determine whether they ever saw home again. Henry V walked among his troops, speaking with soldiers and reinforcing morale. Medieval kings often fought personally in battle, and Henry intended to stand with his men in the front line. This presence mattered. Seeing the king share the same danger strengthened discipline and confidence. Not all modern observers view such actions purely as heroic gestures. Leadership on medieval battlefields had a practical effect. A visible king stabilized morale and prevented panic. If soldiers believed their commander was committed to the fight, they were far more likely to hold their position. As the morning progressed, tension grew between the two armies. Across the muddy field, the French knights prepared their armor and mounted their horses. Banners from dozens of noble houses fluttered above the ranks. From a distance, the French force looked overwhelming, an ocean of steel and color stretching across the horizon. Yet the battlefield remained quiet. The English stood in their narrow corridor between the forests. Stakes pointed outward, like the teeth of a trap. Archers waited with bows already strung. The muddy ground glistened under a gray sky. Eventually, the moment arrived when waiting became impossible. French commanders ordered their army to advance. Thousands of armored knights began moving forward, expecting to crush the smaller English force with sheer momentum. But they were stepping directly into a battlefield that had been carefully engineered against them. The battlefield of Agincourt was not a grand open plain where armies could maneuver freely. It was something far more deceptive. At first glance, the ground appeared ordinary farmland, long stretches of earth bordered by too dense forests. Yet in warfare, geography often decides outcomes long before the first sword is drawn. On that cold October morning, the landscape itself quietly favored the smaller army. The two forests, Tramecourt Wood on one side and Agincourt Wood on the other, formed natural boundaries that narrowed the fighting space dramatically. Instead of a wide field where tens of thousands of soldiers could spread out, the battlefield became a compressed corridor, only several hundred meters across. Imagine trying to move a massive crowd through a narrow alley. Numbers stop being an advantage when there is simply no room to use them. This narrow front was exactly what Henry V's strategy required. If the French army had been able to deploy its full strength across open terrain, the English line would likely have been overwhelmed quickly. But here, the forests forced the French forces into a funnel. Only the soldiers at the front could fight effectively. Thousands behind them would be forced to wait, pushing forward slowly as space allowed. In modern military language, the battlefield had become a choke point. But terrain alone was not the only factor shaping the coming battle. The ground itself had been transformed by weather. In the days leading up to the confrontation, heavy rains soaked the farmland. What had once been firm, plowed soil turned into thick mud. For lightly equipped soldiers, mud is an inconvenience. For heavily armored knights riding large war horses, it becomes something far worse. A fully armored medieval knight could carry between 25 to 30 kilograms of steel armor, not counting weapons. The war horse beneath him carried even more weight, including armor for the animal itself in some cases. When such a force moves across muddy terrain, momentum disappears quickly. Horses lose speed, hooves sink deep, and balance becomes unstable. The English soldiers observed the ground carefully that morning. Many longbowmen came from farming communities. They knew exactly what freshly plowed, rain-soaked soil could do when thousands of men tried to cross it at once. Henry positioned his army at the slightly higher end of the field, giving them a subtle but useful advantage. French attackers would need to advance uphill through mud while under arrow fire. The difference in elevation was small, but on a battlefield, even minor slopes can affect movement and fatigue. The English line itself remained compact. Men-at-arms formed a solid center, shoulder to shoulder, shields and polearms ready. On both sides, the longbowmen stood behind their sharpened wooden stakes, bows prepared, and arrows planted in the soil in front of them. From a distance, the English position looked almost fragile, a thin line of soldiers facing an army several times their size. But the terrain transformed that thin line into a barrier. As the French army began forming up across the field, the scale of their force became clear. Rows of armored knights stood ready, banners rising above them in bright colors, representing noble houses from across France. Behind them gathered additional waves of infantry and reserve forces. In theory, the plan was simple. Cavalry would advance first, breaking the English archers and disrupting their lines. Once the longbowmen were scattered, the heavily armored men-at-arms would push forward and crush the remaining English soldiers. But theory rarely survives contact with terrain. The muddy field immediately began slowing the French advance. Horses could not accelerate properly. Formations became uneven as some sections moved faster than others. Knights trying to maintain tight lines struggled as hooves slipped and sank into the wet soil. Meanwhile, the narrowing battlefield created pressure from behind. Thousands of soldiers waiting further back began pushing forward, compressing the front ranks even before they reached the English line. This compression created a dangerous situation. Soldiers in the front could not maneuver freely. Those behind could not see clearly what was happening ahead. The English watched quietly. Longbowmen understood that their effectiveness depended on range and timing. Too early and arrows would fall short. Too late, and the cavalry might reach the line before enough arrows could be fired. Henry waited. Not all historians interpret this moment in exactly the same way, but many emphasize the extraordinary discipline shown by the English soldiers. Despite facing a much larger army, they did not panic or rush forward. They remained in position, allowing the terrain and weather to work in their favor. In contrast, the French army faced growing impatience. Noble knights had gathered expecting a dramatic charge that would quickly overwhelm the enemy. Instead, they found themselves advancing slowly through mud toward a quiet enemy line that refused to react. That silence was deceptive. Every longbowman stood ready with a weapon capable of launching arrows at remarkable speed. Each archer could send multiple shafts into the air within seconds. Multiply that by thousands of archers and the effect becomes difficult to imagine until it actually happens. Across the muddy corridor, the distance between the two armies continued shrinking. The French cavalry began to move faster despite the terrain, urged forward by the momentum of thousands of soldiers behind them. Horses struggled for footing. Armor clanked as knights leaned forward with lances prepared. The English line remained steady. The longbowmen raised their bows, and within moments, the quiet battlefield would transform into one of the most famous storms of arrows in military history. The moment of the first clash did not begin with the thunder of hooves or the clash of steel. It began with silence, the kind that settles over a battlefield just before thousands of men move at once. Across the muddy corridor between the two forests, the French army continued advancing slowly, their banners fluttering above a sea of polished armor. Knights adjusted their lances, infantry struggled through the wet ground behind them, and commanders urged the front ranks forward. From their perspective, the English line ahead looked thin and vulnerable, just a narrow formation of soldiers standing behind wooden stakes. Many French nobles expected the engagement to end quickly. The enemy army was smaller, exhausted from weeks of marching, and trapped far from safety. What they did not fully appreciate was how quickly the balance of power could shift once the longbows began to speak. Henry V watched the approaching army carefully and waited until the distance was exactly where he wanted it. Longbowmen stood ready with arrows already planted in the earth in front of them, an efficient system that allowed archers to fire rapidly without fumbling for ammunition. When the signal finally came, thousands of bows bent backward at nearly the same moment. The sound of yew wood flexing under tremendous tension rippled across the English line like a sudden gust of wind through trees. Then the first volley was released. Arrows lifted into the gray sky in massive arcs, rising high before descending toward the advancing French ranks. Within seconds, another volley followed, and then another, until the air above the battlefield seemed filled with dark streaks, falling toward the enemy. For the French cavalry at the front, the effect was immediate and chaotic. War horses began to panic as arrows struck armor, saddles, and flesh. Even when arrows failed to penetrate a knight's plate armor, the impact alone could startle a horse or knock a rider off balance. Horses were far more vulnerable than the armored men riding them, and once a wounded horse collapsed, the knight on its back suddenly found himself struggling to stand in deep mud while wearing dozens of kilograms of steel. Momentum, the critical element of a cavalry charge, vanished almost instantly. Instead of accelerating toward the English line, the advancing formations slowed, stumbled, and broke apart. The English longbowmen continued firing relentlessly. A trained archer could loose an arrow every few seconds, and thousands of archers working simultaneously produced a level of projectile saturation rarely seen in medieval warfare. Arrows struck shields, armor joints, horses, and exposed faces. Many landed harmlessly in the mud, but the sheer volume meant that enough found vulnerable targets to disrupt the entire advance. Knights trying to maintain formation suddenly found fallen horses blocking their path. Riders swerved to avoid obstacles, colliding with other cavalrymen and further breaking the cohesion of the charge. What was meant to be a unified assault gradually transformed into scattered clusters of armored riders struggling forward through mud and arrow fire. Not all arrows were meant to kill outright. Some were designed simply to break rhythm, and in warfare, rhythm matters enormously. Cavalry charges rely on speed and coordination. When hundreds of horses begin moving at slightly different speeds, when riders must slow down to avoid fallen bodies, and when arrows continue raining down every few seconds, the charge loses its destructive force long before it reaches the enemy line. In that sense, the English longbow was not just a weapon. It was a system designed to disrupt motion. A few French cavalry units did manage to push forward despite the arrow storm. Determined knights lowered their lances and drove their horses toward the English flanks where the longbowmen stood. Yet even here the English preparation showed its value. The sharpened wooden stakes planted in front of the archers created a defensive barrier that prevented horses from charging directly into their ranks. Horses approaching the stakes instinctively slowed or veered aside, giving the archers enough time to retreat behind the English men-at-arms positioned in the center. In effect, the archers were not isolated targets, but part of a layered defensive structure. Meanwhile, the muddy field continued doing its quiet work. Each fallen horse created another obstacle. Each wounded knight struggling to stand added to the congestion. Behind the cavalry, the French men-at-arms began advancing on foot, but they too encountered the same problem. The ground was already crowded with bodies, broken equipment, and panicked animals. Every step became harder. Armor that had once provided protection now became an exhausting burden. Observers later described the scene as increasingly chaotic. The narrow corridor between the forests filled with armored men pushing forward, while others attempted to move around fallen soldiers. The English line, however, remained largely intact. Longbowmen continued firing from the sides, while the central formation of men-at-arms waited patiently for the enemy to close the final distance. This moment reveals something important about medieval warfare that often gets overlooked. Battles were not always decided by single heroic charges or dramatic duels between knights. More often, they were decided by systems of pressure, weapons, terrain, timing, and discipline all interacting at once. At Agincourt, arrows created pressure from above, mud created resistance from below, and the narrow battlefield prevented the French army from reorganizing effectively. Not every French soldier lost heart immediately. Many continued pushing forward with determination, believing that once they reached the English line, their superior armor and numbers would still decide the fight. And in fairness, heavily armored men-at-arms fighting at close range were extremely dangerous opponents. If enough of them could reach the English center at the same time, the outcome might still change dramatically. But reaching that center was proving far more difficult than expected. With every passing minute, the French advance slowed further. Horses collapsed. Knights struggled through knee-deep mud. Arrows continued falling from the sky in relentless waves. What had begun as a confident advance was rapidly turning into something far less organized. The first clash had begun, but the real struggle, the brutal fight at arm's length, was still about to unfold. By the time the first waves of French cavalry collapsed under the storm of arrows, the battle had already begun transforming into something the French commanders had not planned for. Instead of a clean breakthrough followed by organized infantry support, the battlefield was becoming increasingly crowded with fallen horses, wounded knights, and broken equipment. Behind the cavalry, the main body of French men-at-arms continued advancing on foot. These were heavily armored professional fighters, many of them nobles themselves, determined to reach the English line and restore order to the attack. Yet, as they stepped forward into the muddy corridor between the two forests, they encountered a growing problem that had little to do with English weapons and everything to do with physics. The battlefield was narrowing into a dense mass of bodies. Thousands of French soldiers were moving forward, but the terrain allowed only a limited number to actually reach the front at any given moment. Those in the rear continued pushing ahead, unaware of the obstacles forming closer to the English line. As a result, the entire attacking force began compressing into an increasingly tight formation. Armor that normally offered protection in combat now became a heavy burden in deep mud. Every step required enormous effort, and the closer the soldiers moved toward the English line, the more difficult it became to maneuver. The English longbowmen continued firing during this advance, though the character of the battle was gradually shifting. At longer distances, arrows disrupted cavalry charges and wounded horses. Now, as the French men-at-arms approached on foot, the archers aimed lower and fired into the crowded mass of advancing soldiers. Even when arrows did not penetrate armor, the constant impacts forced knights to raise shields, slow their pace, and lose coordination with the men beside them. The relentless arrow fire also ensured that the French advance could never regain a steady rhythm. What began forming in the center of the battlefield was something historians often describe as human compression. Imagine thousands of armored men pushing forward through thick mud, while the front ranks struggle to climb over fallen horses and bodies. The men behind cannot see what is happening ahead, yet they continue moving forward under pressure from those behind them. Gradually, the entire formation becomes so tightly packed that individuals lose the ability to swing weapons freely or even maintain balance. Under these conditions, fatigue becomes a silent enemy. French knights wore armor designed to withstand sword blows, but that armor was never meant for prolonged wrestling in knee-deep mud, surrounded by hundreds of other soldiers. Breathing became difficult inside closed helmets. Men slipped, stumbled, and sometimes fell entirely. Once a knight fell in such crowded conditions, standing up again could be almost impossible. The weight of armor combined with the pressure of surrounding bodies could trap a soldier on the ground. Meanwhile, the English center remained remarkably stable. Henry V had positioned his dismounted men-at-arms in a tight defensive formation, allowing them to fight effectively even against heavily armored opponents. Because they were standing on firmer ground and not advancing through mud, they retained far more control over their movements. When the leading French soldiers finally reached the English line, the fight shifted from arrows to brutal close combat. Poleaxes, swords, and daggers began clashing against steel armor. The English line absorbed the impact of the first French attackers, but the attackers were already exhausted from their slow advance through mud and arrow fire. Their formations were uneven, their momentum broken, and their numbers unable to deploy properly in the narrow battlefield. In theory, the French army still possessed overwhelming numerical superiority, but in practice, only a small portion of those soldiers could actually fight at the front. Longbowmen soon played another unexpected role. Once many of the French knights had reached the English line, some archers began abandoning their bows and joining the melee with mallets, short swords, and axes. Archers were not heavily armored, but they were mobile and could move quickly across the battlefield. Their ability to maneuver around slower, heavily armored opponents allowed them to attack vulnerable points in armor joints or assist English men-at-arms struggling in the dense fighting. Not all observers expected archers to play such an active role in close combat, but the situation at Agincourt created unique conditions. The mud and compression had slowed the French advance so severely that lightly armored English soldiers could move more freely. In effect, the very weight that protected French knights in battle now worked against them when movement became restricted. At this stage, the battlefield resembled less a traditional medieval charge and more a massive struggle for space. French soldiers at the front tried desperately to push forward, believing that if enough of them could reach the English line simultaneously, they might finally break through. But the compressed mass behind them prevented effective coordination. Each soldier fought largely as an individual, rather than as part of a disciplined formation. From a modern analytical perspective, this moment highlights how logistics and environment can override numerical superiority. The French army was still far larger than the English force, but its ability to convert that size into effective combat power had been crippled by terrain, weather, and battlefield congestion. As the fight intensified, the front ranks of French men-at-arms began to lose strength. Exhaustion spread quickly among soldiers trapped in heavy armor while struggling through mud and constant physical pressure. Some knights attempted to retreat to regain space and breathe, but the mass of soldiers behind them made withdrawal almost impossible. The battle was reaching a dangerous threshold. If the French could somehow reorganize and launch a coordinated push, the English line might still collapse under sheer weight. But if the congestion continued growing, the attacking army risked losing not only momentum but also morale. At Agincourt, the battlefield itself had become a weapon, and it was beginning to turn decisively against the French. By the time the fighting reached its most intense phase, the battlefield no longer resembled the clean formations imagined in medieval warfare manuals. Instead, it had become a dense, exhausting struggle in which thousands of armored men fought not only each other, but also the mud beneath their feet and the crushing pressure of bodies around them. The French men-at-arms who had managed to reach the English line were already drained from their slow advance across the field, their armor soaked with mud and rain, their breathing restricted by helmets that trapped heat and moisture. What was meant to be a decisive assault had gradually transformed into a grueling test of endurance, and endurance was exactly where the balance of the battle began shifting toward the English. French knights at the front had expected a quick breakthrough once they reached the English line. Instead, they encountered disciplined resistance from English men-at-arms standing shoulder to shoulder. Poleaxes struck against helmets, swords scraped along armor plates, and shields pushed against shields in a slow, grinding contest for inches of ground. Yet every movement demanded energy, and energy was running out quickly for the French attackers. Each step forward required lifting armored legs from thick mud while pressing against other soldiers who were equally desperate for space. Meanwhile, the English soldiers held a crucial advantage. They were not advancing. Standing mostly on firmer ground near the edge of the forest, the English men-at-arms could plant their feet and concentrate their strength on defending the line rather than forcing their way through mud. This difference might seem small, but in prolonged combat, it meant everything. A soldier who must constantly struggle simply to remain upright loses stamina far faster than one who can maintain balance and control. Longbowmen, who had already joined the melee, began exploiting this advantage. Moving more lightly across the battlefield without heavy plate armor, many archers maneuvered around the flanks of the struggling French soldiers. Armed now with axes, knives, or wooden mallets, they attacked vulnerable joints in armor, under the arms, behind the knees, or at the visor openings of helmets. These strikes were not always immediately lethal, but they added pressure to an already exhausted enemy. When a heavily armored knight stumbled or fell in the mud, archers could swarm him quickly before he regained footing. Not every French soldier collapsed under exhaustion at once. Many fought with determination and courage, pushing forward despite the chaos around them. But courage alone could not overcome the physical realities of the battlefield. The mass of soldiers trapped in the narrow corridor continued compressing forward, making it harder for those at the front to move or even breathe comfortably. Helmets limited airflow. Armor trapped body heat. Mud clung to boots and greaves, adding extra weight with every step. At this stage, the battlefield began producing a grim chain reaction. When a knight slipped or was knocked down, others behind him often stumbled as well. Soon, small clusters of fallen soldiers formed obstacles that slowed the entire formation further. Men trying to climb over these obstacles lost balance, creating even more disruption. Within minutes, the once proud assault formations of French nobility had become tangled masses of armored bodies, struggling simply to remain standing. Some French commanders attempted to rally their men and restore order, urging them forward in renewed attacks against the English center. But coordination had already broken down. Messages could not travel easily through the compressed crowd of soldiers. Trumpets and shouted commands were drowned out by the noise of combat. Each knight fought his own immediate battle rather than following a coordinated plan. The English soldiers, by contrast, maintained surprising cohesion. Henry V himself fought among the front ranks, reinforcing morale and ensuring that his men held their ground. Leadership mattered enormously in moments like this. Seeing the king fighting alongside them encouraged English soldiers to endure the pressure rather than retreat. One aspect of the battle that often surprises modern readers is how slowly the turning point developed. Medieval battles sometimes ended quickly, when one side broke morale early. At Agincourt, the opposite happened. The fight continued for hours, gradually draining the strength of the French attackers until their advantage in numbers became irrelevant. Eventually, exhaustion began tipping the balance decisively. French knights, who had pushed forward with confidence earlier, now struggled simply to raise their weapons. Some attempted to withdraw to regain space and breathe, but the mass of soldiers behind them prevented any organized retreat. Others continued pressing forward but lacked the strength to break through the English line. From a tactical perspective, the French army had entered what modern analysts might describe as combat saturation. Too many soldiers were occupying too little space, preventing effective maneuver. Instead of multiplying combat power, the army's size had effectively neutralized itself. This moment marked the true turning point of the battle. The English soldiers sensed the weakening pressure in front of them. Where earlier waves of attackers had pressed hard against the line, now the assaults became uneven and fragmented. Gaps appeared among the French ranks as exhausted knights slowed or collapsed. Henry V recognized the shift immediately. When the opportunity emerged, the English line began pushing forward slightly, counterattacking against French soldiers who no longer had the strength or coordination to resist effectively. It was not a dramatic cavalry charge or heroic breakthrough. It was something far more decisive. A slow, disciplined push against an enemy already collapsing under the weight of exhaustion. And once that collapse began, the rest of the battle would follow quickly. Once exhaustion began weakening the French assault, the structure of the entire attack started unraveling with surprising speed. The front ranks of French men-at-arms had already spent enormous energy forcing their way across the muddy field, fighting through arrow fire and the crushing pressure of thousands of soldiers behind them. Now, as the English line pushed forward slightly in response to their weakening momentum, those exhausted knights found themselves losing the small amount of space they had managed to gain. In tightly packed formations, even a few steps backward or forward could disrupt balance. When the English began pressing against them, the fragile equilibrium of the battlefield finally broke. The first signs of collapse appeared as small pockets of disorder along the French front. Knights who had fallen into the mud struggled desperately to stand, but with armor weighing heavily and other soldiers pressing around them, many simply could not rise again. Those behind them stumbled over bodies and equipment, creating even larger obstacles. The dense compression that had slowed the French advance now turned into a trap, preventing both forward movement and organized retreat. Soldiers trapped in the middle of the formation found themselves squeezed from all directions, while the English continued striking at close range. English longbowmen, now fully engaged in the melee alongside the men-at-arms, moved quickly across the battlefield, exploiting the growing chaos. Without the heavy armor of the French knights, they could maneuver more easily through the mud and around fallen bodies. Armed with axes, daggers, and mallets, they targeted vulnerable points in armor joints and attacked isolated opponents who had lost balance. Many French soldiers, already exhausted and struggling for air inside their helmets, simply could not defend themselves effectively in such conditions. At the same time, the narrow battlefield continued preventing the French reserves from intervening effectively. Thousands of additional soldiers remained further back behind the front lines, but the congestion between the two forests meant they could not reach the fight in a coordinated manner. Instead of reinforcing the struggling front ranks, the weight of these additional troops only increased the pressure and confusion in the rear. The psychological effect of this situation spread quickly. Medieval battles often hinged on morale, and morale could shift suddenly when soldiers sensed that victory was slipping away. French knights who had expected a swift triumph now found themselves trapped in a suffocating struggle with little room to maneuver. The realization that the English line was not breaking and might actually be pushing forward began eroding confidence across the battlefield. Not every soldier reacted the same way. Some French nobles continued fighting fiercely despite the worsening conditions, determined to fulfill their code of honor regardless of the outcome. Others attempted to withdraw from the front ranks, hoping to regroup and launch another attack, but withdrawal proved extremely difficult in such crowded conditions. Soldiers attempting to move backward collided with men still pushing forward, and confusion spread rapidly. Meanwhile, the English line maintained its discipline. Henry V and his commanders resisted the temptation to charge recklessly after the weakening enemy. Instead, they continued applying steady pressure, allowing the conditions that had already crippled the French advance to finish their work. This restraint was critical. A chaotic English pursuit could have exposed their own soldiers to counterattacks. By advancing slowly and deliberately, the English ensured that the French forces remained trapped in the muddy corridor. Another factor accelerating the French collapse was simple physical exhaustion. Knights who had fought for hours in heavy armor were reaching the limits of human endurance. Breathing through narrow helmet openings became increasingly difficult. Arms that once swung swords with power now struggled to lift weapons at all. Some soldiers attempted to remove helmets for air, But doing so in the middle of combat exposed them to immediate danger. As the pressure intensified, entire clusters of French soldiers began surrendering or falling where they stood. In medieval warfare, capture was often preferable to death because prisoners could be ransomed for money. English soldiers quickly recognized this opportunity. Capturing noble prisoners could bring significant wealth, and many French knights were valuable hostages. Yet even this process added to the chaos. Prisoners had to be controlled, guarded, and moved away from the fighting, which further crowded the already limited space. Bodies of fallen horses and soldiers continued accumulating across the battlefield, making movement even more difficult for those still fighting. Observers later described the battlefield at this stage as a dense mass of armor and mud, where organized formations had completely dissolved. The once confident French army had become a tangled struggle of individuals fighting for survival within a collapsing structure of soldiers and equipment. The English soldiers sensed the irreversible shift. What had begun as a desperate defensive stand by a smaller army had transformed into a battlefield dominated by their control of space and endurance. Every minute that passed made the French position worse. Their numbers, once their greatest advantage, had now become the source of their greatest vulnerability. Eventually, the resistance of the French front ranks began fading entirely. Isolated groups of knights continued fighting bravely, but the coordinated assault that had once threatened the English line was gone. The battlefield had turned decisively. The collapse of the French army was no longer a possibility. It was already unfolding. And as the final pockets of resistance faded, the scale of what had just happened on that muddy field would begin to reveal itself. When the fighting finally slowed and the noise of battle faded, the field of Agincourt revealed a result that stunned everyone who saw it. Hours earlier, a massive French army had marched confidently toward a smaller English force trapped deep inside enemy territory. By the end of the day, that same field was filled with fallen knights, broken banners, and abandoned armor. What had been expected to be a decisive French victory had instead become one of the most shocking defeats in medieval military history. The consequences began to appear immediately. French losses were staggering, particularly among the nobility. Many of the most powerful lords of France had fought in the front ranks, eager for prestige and honor. In medieval warfare, this was common. Nobles were expected to lead personally in battle. Yet that tradition now produced devastating results. When the French front line collapsed, it was not just ordinary soldiers who fell, but some of the most influential figures in the kingdom. Entire noble houses suddenly lost leaders in a single day. Dukes, counts, and high-ranking commanders were either killed or captured. The political impact of such losses rippled through France quickly. A kingdom already weakened by internal rivalries now faced the sudden disappearance of many experienced military leaders. The English army, by contrast, had suffered remarkably lighter losses. Their smaller numbers and defensive position had limited the exposure of their soldiers to direct attacks. While English casualties certainly occurred, battle is never without cost. The scale of loss was nowhere near that suffered by the French. This imbalance shocked contemporaries across Europe. Medieval warfare was built around the prestige of heavily armored knights. They were widely considered the dominant force on the battlefield. The idea that thousands of such warriors could be defeated by a smaller army composed largely of archers challenged long-standing assumptions about how wars were supposed to be fought. Word of the battle spread rapidly. Messengers carried reports to royal courts and noble families across the continent. Many accounts describe the field as nearly unrecognizable after the fighting ended, covered with fallen armor and weapons scattered across the mud. Survivors struggled to comprehend how such a large army could have collapsed so completely. For Henry V, the victory had enormous political value. Only weeks earlier, his army had been weakened by disease and exhaustion during the siege of Harfleur. His march across northern France had been risky, even desperate. Yet now he returned from that campaign with a triumph that elevated his reputation dramatically. Kings in the medieval world relied heavily on reputation. A ruler who demonstrated military success gained legitimacy among both allies and rivals. The victory at Agincourt transformed Henry's image from a young king seeking recognition into a formidable military leader capable of defeating overwhelming odds. France, meanwhile, entered a period of deeper instability. The loss of so many nobles intensified existing political divisions within the kingdom. Rival factions blamed each other for the defeat. Some criticized the reckless confidence of the cavalry charges, while others argued that poor coordination among commanders had allowed the English to exploit the terrain effectively. Not all historical interpretations focus solely on the heroism of one side or the mistakes of the other. Battles are rarely decided by a single factor. At Agincourt, several elements converged at once: terrain, weather, weapon technology, leadership, and the psychology of armies expecting victory. When these elements aligned against the French, the result became almost inevitable. Another consequence involved the large number of prisoners captured during the battle. In medieval warfare, capturing noble prisoners was often financially valuable because they could be ransomed for significant sums. English soldiers quickly realized that many of the captured French knights represented enormous potential wealth. However, the situation remained tense even after the fighting slowed. Reports reached Henry that additional French forces might still be nearby and could attack the English army while it was distracted managing prisoners. Faced with this possibility, Henry made a controversial decision. He ordered the execution of many prisoners to prevent them from rising up during a renewed attack. This decision has been debated by historians for centuries. Some argue that it was a brutal but pragmatic response to the dangers of the battlefield. Others view it as a tragic moment that reflected the desperation of warfare in such uncertain conditions. Either way, it underscores how chaotic and unpredictable medieval battles could be, even after the main fighting ended. As the English army eventually prepared to continue its march toward Calais, the scale of their achievement became clearer. A force of roughly 6,000 soldiers had defeated an army several times its size on foreign soil. The victory would echo through military history for centuries. But beyond the dramatic numbers and heroic narratives, Agincourt also revealed something deeper about warfare itself. Battles are not simply contests of bravery or honor. They are complex interactions between technology, environment, leadership, and human endurance. And in that sense, the muddy field between two forests had delivered a lesson that military thinkers would continue studying long after the banners and armor had disappeared from the ground. The Battle of Agincourt quickly became more than a dramatic story of victory against overwhelming odds. For soldiers, commanders, and historians who studied it afterward, the battle offered something even more important: a set of military lessons about how wars are actually won. Beneath the legend of heroic archers and defeated knights lies a deeper truth about adaptation. How armies that understand change can defeat opponents who rely too heavily on tradition. For centuries, the heavily armored knight had dominated European battlefields. Mounted cavalry charges were seen as the ultimate expression of military power. Armor technology had advanced significantly during the late medieval period, and knights often appeared nearly invulnerable to the weapons of earlier generations. Yet the English longbow quietly challenged that dominance. It did not completely eliminate the effectiveness of armored knights, but it forced them to operate under new constraints. When thousands of arrows could reach targets from long distances and disrupt cavalry charges before impact, the battlefield dynamics changed fundamentally. This shift resembles patterns seen throughout military history. When new technologies appear, armies that integrate them effectively gain enormous advantages. Those that cling too tightly to older traditions often struggle. The French knights at Agincourt were brave and experienced warriors, but their battlefield doctrine still centered on decisive cavalry charges. Against a defensive formation built around long-range projectile fire and protected by terrain, that doctrine proved vulnerable. Henry V's decision to position his army between two forests transformed the battlefield into a narrow corridor. By doing so, he reduced the French numerical advantage and forced their army into compressed formations. Terrain has always played a decisive role in warfare. From ancient mountain passes to modern urban battlefields, commanders who understand the landscape can reshape the entire fight before it begins. At Agincourt, the muddy farmland amplified this effect dramatically. Weather is often treated as an uncontrollable variable in warfare. Yet skilled commanders recognize how environmental conditions influence movement, logistics, and morale. The rain that turned the field into mud did not affect both armies equally. Because the French had to advance across that ground while wearing heavy armor, the mud multiplied their fatigue and slowed their assault. The English, positioned defensively on firmer ground, avoided the worst of those conditions. Another lesson concerns discipline and cohesion. The English army maintained remarkably stable formations throughout the battle. Archers continued firing in coordinated volleys, and men-at-arms held their line even when the French forces pressed close. Discipline in battle is rarely about rigid obedience alone. It is about maintaining collective focus under extreme pressure. When soldiers trust their formation and leadership, they resist the instinct to panic or break ranks. The French army, by contrast, struggled with coordination once the initial charge failed. Medieval armies often consisted of numerous noble contingents, led by individual commanders. While these nobles were courageous fighters, the structure sometimes made unified control difficult during chaotic battles. At Agincourt, the compressed battlefield and exhaustion of the front ranks prevented effective communication, turning the attack into a series of fragmented efforts rather than a coordinated push. Not every historian interprets Agincourt purely as a triumph of technology over tradition. Some emphasize that similar battles in other contexts did not always produce the same result. Longbow armies could still be defeated under different conditions. What makes Agincourt particularly significant is the combination of factors working together: weapon systems, terrain, weather, discipline, and leadership all interacting in the same moment. From a broader perspective, the battle also illustrates the importance of strategic patience. Henry V did not rush into reckless attacks despite being deep in enemy territory. Instead, he forced the French army to fight under conditions that favored the English defensive system. In warfare, forcing the opponent to fight on unfavorable terms is often more decisive than simply possessing more soldiers. There is also a human lesson hidden within the technical analysis. Medieval warfare often celebrated individual bravery and noble reputation. Yet, Agincourt reminds us that even the most prestigious warriors are limited by physical reality. Armor grows heavy in mud. Horses panic under arrow fire. Exhaustion eventually weakens every soldier regardless of rank or title. Battles are not decided solely by heroic ideals, but by the practical limits of human endurance. Modern military analysts sometimes view Agincourt as an early example of how systems thinking applies to warfare. Instead of relying on a single decisive element, the English army combined multiple reinforcing factors: terrain positioning, longbow firepower, defensive stakes, and disciplined infantry lines. Each element supported the others, creating a defensive network that gradually wore down a larger attacking force. These lessons echo across centuries of military development. Whether in medieval Europe, early modern gunpowder warfare, or modern mechanized conflicts, successful armies repeatedly demonstrate the ability to adapt their tactics to evolving technologies and environments. Agincourt therefore stands not only as a dramatic historical battle, but also as a reminder that warfare rewards those who understand change. Armies that evolve their strategies to match new realities often achieve victories that appear impossible at first glance. And on that muddy field in northern France, adaptation proved far more powerful than numbers alone. 6,000 English soldiers had walked onto that muddy field, expecting a desperate fight for survival. 30,000 French knights had arrived expecting a swift and honorable victory. By nightfall, the balance of those expectations had been completely reversed. The Battle of Agincourt did more than decide a single day of combat. It reshaped how people remembered medieval warfare and how later generations understood the fragile relationship between power, confidence, and reality. For many listeners today, the story naturally invites a simple conclusion. The smaller army triumphed because of superior tactics and weapons. That explanation is partly true, yet history is rarely so tidy. Battles unfold through a complex interaction of human decisions, environmental conditions, and the unpredictable momentum of events. At Agincourt, the English longbow, the muddy terrain, the narrow battlefield, and the exhaustion of the French army all combined to produce an outcome few observers expected at the beginning of the day. One useful way to view the battle is through perspective. The ability to step back from dramatic narratives and ask what the event reveals about human behavior. Armies throughout history have often entered battle convinced that numbers or prestige guaranteed victory. Yet again and again, the battlefield reminds commanders that confidence without adaptability can become dangerous. The French army at Agincourt possessed courage, experience, and overwhelming numerical strength. But those advantages could not overcome terrain, weather, and the tactical system the English army employed. Not all victories carry the same meaning across time. In the years following Agincourt, the war between England and France continued with shifting fortunes for both sides. England would eventually lose most of its French territories, despite the triumph Henry V achieved on that famous field. This reminds us that even the most dramatic victories rarely decide entire wars by themselves. They become chapters within much longer stories shaped by diplomacy, economics, and political change. Yet, Agincourt endured in memory for a different reason. It offered a powerful example of how disciplined soldiers using effective strategy could overcome an opponent that seemed vastly stronger. That lesson resonated not only with medieval chroniclers, but also with military thinkers in later centuries. Generals and historians repeatedly returned to the battle when discussing the relationship between technology, terrain, and leadership. There is also a more human perspective worth considering. Medieval battles often appear distant to modern audiences. Rows of armored knights clashing in fields long since returned to farmland. But behind every helmet and shield stood individuals facing fear, exhaustion, and uncertainty. English archers standing behind their wooden stakes knew they were confronting a much larger army. French knights advancing through the mud believed they were defending the honor and power of their kingdom. Both sides were shaped by the values and expectations of their time. When studying such battles, it becomes easy to focus only on tactics and outcomes, while overlooking the deeper human cost. Thousands of soldiers did not return home from that field. Families across France and England felt the consequences of decisions made by kings and commanders. Even the victorious army carried the memory of a brutal struggle that pushed men to their limits of endurance. History therefore offers two different kinds of lessons. One involves strategy, technology, and the mechanics of warfare. The other involves the enduring reminder that conflict always leaves lasting consequences for the people involved. Recognizing both perspectives helps transform historical battles from simple tales of victory or defeat into deeper reflections on how societies confront power and violence. How often do we assume that strength lies only in numbers or prestige? Modern life presents similar patterns in many fields: business, politics, technology, where smaller groups sometimes succeed by adapting faster or thinking differently than larger rivals. The battlefield of 1415 illustrates that advantage does not always belong to the biggest force, but often to the side that understands the situation more clearly. That insight helps explain why the battle continues to capture attention centuries later. It is not merely the image of longbows darkening the sky or knights struggling through mud. It is the realization that outcomes we assume are inevitable can change dramatically when conditions shift. And perhaps that is the final reflection worth leaving with the audience. History is full of moments when events seemed predictable until they suddenly were not. On one autumn day in northern France, 6,000 soldiers facing overwhelming odds demonstrated exactly how quickly certainty can disappear on the battlefield. If stories like this fascinate you, moments where strategy, human endurance, and unexpected decisions reshape the course of events, then you are already seeing history the way historians do. Not as a collection of dates, but as a series of turning points that reveal how people respond when everything is on the line.